So we're going to do a brief overview of the digestive system. So the main organs of the digestive system are part of what we call the digestive tract. So basically, as you swallow food or liquid, these are all organs that this food or liquid would have to pass through, okay, before it can leave your body. So we also refer to this as the GI tract or alimentary canal. Okay, so the list of the organs, we begin with the oral cavity, pharynx, fancy word for throat, the esophagus, which is just the muscular tube that takes the food to the stomach. Stomach then takes it to the small intestines, large intestines, and then last the anus. We have other organs that are part of the digestive system. They're considered accessory because food does not actually pass through them, so they're not part of the tract, but they somehow aid in digestion. Okay, so this is going to include the teeth, the tongue, different organs that produce some type of secretion, okay, including the salivary glands, the liver, the pancreas, as well as the gallbladder. Okay, so the digestive system has a few different functions. In general, the digestive system is to break down food units into small enough pieces where we can absorb it into the bloodstream. Okay, so we have ingestion, which is the actual physical putting the food in the mouth. Mechanical processing, which is the crushing and shearing of food, which is obviously done mainly by the teeth. The tongue aids a little bit in that as well. Digestion technically is two portions. You have physical digestion, which can be the same, or an example of that can be mechanical processing. The stomach also does physical digestion as its hard contractions really mash the food. So it's basically breaking the food into smaller pieces. Versus digestion, chemical digestion uses enzymes or hormones to break down food into smaller pieces by breaking chemical bonds. Secretion would be when we release materials that possibly could be different enzymes and hormones into the lumen, okay, which is going to be where the food particles will be. Absorption is the movement of these organic nutrients from the lumen through the digestive epithelium and into the bloodstream. And then not all of what we bring in we can break down into small enough pieces where we can absorb these units. So we must be able to get rid of these waste products. So of course we do that through the defecation of feces. Okay, so movement of the digestive system is done a few different ways. It's all controlled through smooth muscle. We have different ways that the smooth muscle can act. So there are rhythmic contractions due to what we call pace setter cells. So just like in the heart and the SA node, you had the pacemaker cells, which set the natural rhythm of the heart. You have these cells that do the same thing in your intestines as well. And they do not need a signal. Okay? They depolarize and therefore send the contraction wave through the smooth muscle on their own. One of the movements that this creates is what we call peristalsis. This is when, remember, the digestive tract is part of a mucosal membrane. So the very external portion of this part is the smooth muscle layer, which forms what we call the muscularis externa. So as that begins to contract, that's going to move the lump of digested food and secretions, which we call the bolus, through the digestive tract. And these waves basically are done by the two alternating smooth muscle layers within the muscularis externa. So you have an inner circular layer, which moves the bolus forward, where the longitudinal layer will move it back and forth, ensuring that all of the food as well as the enzymes are being mixed to allow the food to properly be digested. And then the small and large intestine, you also have segmentation, which is when you segment portions of the food, digested food, which we call a bolus. And again, you basically turn the bolus over with the contractions, ensuring that the mixing, they're good mixing waves, that the enzymes act on all of the food and that everything gets absorbed appropriately. So other things that control the digestive system other than these pacemaker cells, okay, you have outside mechanisms, the nervous system, which does it through the parasympathetic nervous system. Remember, the parasympathetic nervous system was part of the ANS, and that was your rest and digest. So when your digestive system is active, it's the parasympathetic that basically turns it on and begins the activation of it. You also have what we call local reflexes. This is basically when you eat and your stomach gets stretched. The stretching of the stomach would be a local reflex that would trigger organs around the stomach and the stomach itself to begin the next part of the digestion. You have hormonal mechanisms. These are hormones that will make smooth muscle contractions increase. Others make smooth muscle contractions decrease. So they inhibit. Local mechanisms can respond to, as I mentioned earlier, more of like a stretching. They can also respond to changes of pH. Mainly where you see this is in the stomach. You have a drop in pH because of the hydrochloric acid. And then in the small intestines, we're going to talk about how that changes because of the things that are added. So that might trigger the stomach or small intestines to stop or add to make sure that the pH doesn't get too acidic. So the mouth, the oral cavity, basically analyzes the material before we swallow. This involves us being able to taste. To taste, you have to be able to produce saliva. You know, we want to make sure that we're not going to ingest anything that's potentially poisonous. Of course, you have mechanical processing. That's the actual chewing. Lubricate by adding saliva. And the saliva does have some enzymes that begin to chemically break down the food as well. So saliva glands, the average person produces about 1 to 1.5 liters a day, primarily composed of water. They also have some electrolytes, buffers. Remember, buffers are things that resist changes of pH. We have some antibodies that help protect the body from foreign things and some enzymes that are going to begin chemically digesting food. Saliva helps to keep the pH of the mouth appropriately by using the buffers. It lubricates, keeps the mouth moist, adds moistness to the food. Again, I said that food has to be moist. You have to add water to be able to taste. And it produces what we call salivary amylase. That begins to break down starches. So what controls the saliva, that is controlled by, again, the ANS, the autonomic nervous system. Again, parasympathetic when we are in our rest and digest mode. So naturally, when you're in parasympathetic, you're going to be salivating more. Different things can also trigger salivation. So if you put anything in your mouth, whether this is a pen cap or gum, if you think about food, if you smell food, whenever you chew, if you feel nauseated, if you have a bad taste, your mouth will salivate to try to remove that taste. So after the mouth has properly mashed the food, broken it down, added the saliva to moisten it, we begin to swallow. Okay, so the food is forced down the pharynx. So the pharynx is for the food, the liquids, as well as it's shared by air. So remember, the respiratory system shares this as well. So basically, we do breathe in air, some from the oral cavity, other through the nasal. That's going to go through the glottis into the larynx and down the trachea into our respiratory. So when we swallow, we want to block the respiratory system off. So we do that by folding over this flap, which is the epiglottis, which will block off the respiratory, and then that forces food to go down the laryngopharynx, which will take it to the esophagus. So the esophagus is just a muscular tube that's about 1 foot long. You have peristalsis that occurs in the esophagus that will move food down into the stomach. The esophagus is normally constricted. The lumen basically is collapsed. So we don't want air getting into the stomach. That could be painful. This also prevents materials that were in the stomach to get back in the esophagus, then potentially back into the pharynx and the mouth. So again, you have the smooth muscle contractions, the peristalsis, which will move the food towards the stomach. As it arrives to the stomach, the gastroesophageal sphincter will relax and the food will be able to enter the stomach. The stomach is where we store the food that we have eaten, ingested. We will mechanically break it down. So the stomach has a lot of smooth muscle that will mash the food. And as it adds the secretions as well, it's going to make it kind of like a smoothie-like consistency. We also will have the chemical breakdown or digestion with different enzymes and hydrochloric acid that's added by the stomach itself. So all of these secretions that are made in the stomach, we call these the gastric juices. And the cells that produce these, we refer to them as the gastric glands. So the gastric glands form part of the mucosal membrane that lines the stomach. And remember, part of the mucosal membrane is the epithelium. So what we're looking at here, this is our simple columnar epithelium. You have a lot of goblet cells. Goblet cells are going to produce mucus, which is actually going to protect the actual cells of the stomach, okay, from being broken down by the acid. Overall, the gastric glands secrete 1,500 milliliters of these juices. And so mucus is just one of those things. There are several others as well. We're just going to talk about some of the main ones. So the two main cells which make up the gastric glands are referred to as the parietal cells and the chief cells. So first of all, basically, what stimulates or tells these different cells when they need to release their secretions? Okay, well, gastric glands also make a hormone called gastrin. Gastrin stimulates all of the other glands to basically start making their juices, okay, which includes the stimulation of the chief and the parietal cells. Okay, because as the juices get made, the stomach will mix those with the food. And once it's properly mixed, then that food particle can be moved to the small intestines, which means we will empty the stomach. So gastric secretions are very acidic. That's because of the hydrochloric acid that's made. So what we're going to have to help buffer that is going to be bicarbonate. We're going to find bicarbonate in bile that's going to be added in the small intestines, as well as from secretions from the pancreas. So chief cells make pepsinogen, which in the presence of hydrochloric acid becomes pepsin. Pepsin breaks down proteins. So the chemical digestion of proteins begins in the stomach. Parietal cells are what make the strong acid mentioned earlier, hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid denatures proteins. So remember, that means it breaks them down, causes them to unravel. So it's easier for pepsin and some other enzymes that break down proteins to further break them down into small peptides and amino acids. The acid is also a very low pH, so many viruses, bacteria cannot survive this, so it kills those. It also makes intrinsic factor, which is something necessary for us to be able to absorb vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 gives you energy. People that are unable to produce this intrinsic factor and therefore unable to absorb vitamin B12, they end up getting pernicious anemia because of this. B12 is necessary to make proper red blood cells. So the gastric secretions added with the food, once it's mixed together, and again kind of makes this smushy, slushy-like material, we call that chyme. Okay, so the food is partially digested. You have some from the salivary amylase. The stomach had the pepsin that started to break down the proteins, as well as the hydrochloric acid that started with that as well. Overall, it is very acidic because of the hydrochloric acid, and it's very watery, fluid-like, no longer solid. So in the stomach, again, we have the physical digestion, the mashing. We have the breaking down of proteins, denaturation, unraveling, which makes it easier to then break the chemical bonds, okay, using pepsin. And also trypsin is made in the stomach. Those will both break down proteins. Infants, of course, consume milk, so they will also have another hormone, renin, that breaks down milk. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the intrinsic factor, there it is with pernicious anemia. And once again, it's the proper consistency, the proper pH. Then the stomach will begin to relax the pyloric sphincter, which is basically a band of smooth muscle. And when that's relaxed, materials from the stomach will be able to start to enter the small intestines. So it controls the secretions of the stomach. They're controlled by nervous and hormones as well. So the production of the acids and the enzymes are controlled by the central nervous system, which does include the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic branch that we mentioned earlier. You also basically have a nervous system of the digestive system of its own. That's what we refer to as the enteric nervous system. And then there are hormones. We mentioned one of these earlier, gastrin, okay, which stimulates the motility, the contraction of the stomach itself. So you have these events that occur in 3 different phases. Okay, so you have the cephalic phase. Cephalic refers to head. So this is basically when you're thinking about food, smelling food, getting ready to eat food. As you're doing that, your stomach and your mouth will begin salivating. It will start making secretions. The gastric phase is after the cephalic. Basically, you begin eating 3 to 4 hours after the food enters the stomach, where the stomach is actually contracting, actively making the secretions and mixing the food. After that time, when the food is the correct consistency and pH, small amounts will begin to be added to the small intestines. And this is, of course, what we call the intestinal phase. And the first portion of the small intestines is what we call the duodenum or duodenum. So once food enters the duodenum, we will then inhibit the stomach. The duodenum will handle that material, pass it along to more distal portions of the small intestine. Then the stomach will contract and deliver more chyme to the duodenum, and it will continue doing this until the stomach is emptied. So the small intestines is where all nutrients are fully digested, broken down, as well as absorbed. This should actually be water absorption, H2O absorption. 90% is in the small intestines. The remaining 10% occurs in the large intestines. You also do have some absorption of vitamins in the large intestines as well. The small intestine, in average, is about 20 feet in length. First portion is the duodenum. Not that I'm going to ask this, but it's a foot or less. This is basically a mixing zone. So you're getting the chyme. This is the acidic, digested, partially digested food mixed with the gastric secretions coming from the stomach. You're also mixing with the secretions from the liver, which we're going to talk about. That's going to be bile, as well as the pancreatic juice, several of the secretions that are going to be added from the pancreas. The jejunum is the next portion. This is where the bulk, the main portion of the digestion, once you've further mixed it, okay, which occurred in the first portion, so you can actually start to break down these organic nutrients to small enough pieces where we can bring them into the bloodstream, which is what absorption is. The ileum is the last portion of the small intestine. It's a little more than half. Typically, it's about 12 feet in length. And you have a smooth muscular valve, the ileocecal valve, which separates the contents from the small intestine, last portion ileum, from the first portion of the large intestines, which is called the cecum, hence ileocecal. So the intestinal juices, this is by these small intestines, what we're talking about here. We make these in response to distension, stretching. Okay, so as the stomach empties and the chyme is dumped into the small intestine, that does cause stretching. Okay, and remember, it is a acidic chyme. So the acidity irritates the mucosa. So these juices are going to be slightly alkaline. Remember, this means basic. So that's going to help buffer that chyme. One of the main components that's going to help buffer here is what we call bicarbonate. And it's going to mainly contain water. Okay, it will have a few enzymes, not very many. It does contain some mucus that will protect the intestinal cells themselves from the acid. It helps move the nutrients and helps it easier to absorb these nutrients through the intestinal cells. 2 new hormones we're going to talk about. So again, the stomach, we had gastrin. In the small intestines, we have secretin and cholecystokinin, for short CCK. So as juices get added into the intestines, they release these, and this increases the pancreas to add its juices to the duodenum, as well as for the liver to add its juices, which are bile, or the bile could have been stored in the gallbladder. You also produce what we call GIP, gastric inhibitory peptide. So this is going to stop the stomach from continuing to empty, okay, until again the duodenum has mixed, buffered, and passed the food along. So the pancreas, with the endocrine system, we talked about the insulin and glucagon that it makes. Those help regulate blood sugar. Okay, now we're going to focus on the exocrine portion. So these glands have ducts, and these ducts basically carry these secretions, which we call the pancreatic juice, into that first part of the small intestines, the duodenum. So they have these granules inside them that make these digestive enzymes. So it too, like bile and like the intestinal juices, is going to be alkaline, okay, or basic. So it's going to be higher than 7. Remember, 7 is neutral. The stomach typically was around 2. Okay, so we still have to buffer that. So it's neutralizing or buffering the chyme. One of the main electrolytes that helps us do that, that's our bicarbonate. So we have pancreatic amylase. Amylase breaks down the starches. Pancreatic lipases breaks down fats. Pancreatic nucleases breaks down nucleic acids. You also have pancreatic proteases that will begin to break down proteins. You have a great chart in your lab book on page 138 that I would suggest looking at, the major digestive secretions. And also, which would be very good to study from your lab book as well, would be page 138, which had the alimentary canal as well as the functions listed beside it. So it will really help you organize, okay, all the thoughts from this presentation. Okay, the liver is the largest visceral organ. That basically means internal. The largest organ of the body was the skin. So the liver receives blood from the hepatic artery, where arteries contain oxygenated blood that all tissues of the body need. But it also has what we call hepatic portal vein. So this portal vein is actually containing blood that's already been through the capillary beds of the small intestines, stomach, spleen, and large intestines. Basically what that means, if a person has eaten in the last several hours, it will be nutrient rich. Okay, if the person has ingested alcohol, any drugs, things like that, that the stomach is absorbed through the stomach, the liver will have to detoxify those. So these cells in the liver, the hepatocytes, have several functions. One of those is that they basically regulate when the blood coming in the liver from the small intestines is nutrient rich. Then they will actually store some of those nutrients for later. If a person hasn't eaten in a long time, the blood coming in would be nutrient poor, and it would actually release some of those stored nutrients from the liver. One of the main ways that we do this is glucose. Okay, we're going to store as glycogen. So when blood sugar is low, then the glycogen will be released by the hepatocytes to raise the glucose levels. And the blood from the liver returns into the inferior vena cava and then goes to the heart. Okay, so then it would go to the rest of the body at the appropriate nutrient level. The liver also makes bile. Bile helps us break down fats. We call it emulsification. It basically breaks down a large lipid droplet into smaller droplets that enzymes can then actively work on. The liver constantly produces bile. However, there's a sphincter. When we're looking at, this is the pancreas, this is our duodenum, this was the stomach, pancreas. Okay, we have the liver up here. So the liver is going to make bile. Okay, and so the bile is going to go, and it's going to try to go in the duodenum, but we have a sphincter that's closed. That sphincter is only open when materials from the stomach have just entered, because that's the only time that we need to break down materials. So when it's closed, which is most of the time, bile is going to be pushed back up. Then it actually goes into a structure right here called the gallbladder, where we can store that and concentrate it. And then when the contents from the stomach do enter the duodenum, then the sphincter relaxes and bile can enter to break down the fat, as well as all those enzymes that are produced from the pancreas. And it's going to mix with that chyme and, remember, buffer it, help raise the pH. So the chyme from the stomach will have some partially digested carbohydrates, some that started from the salivary amylase in the mouth, and then proteins from the pepsin, the trypsin, and the hydrochloric acid. And then you'll have some undigested fats in the chyme as well. So this chyme with these materials, again, will be added to the first portion of the small intestines, duodenum, where we will mix bile, enzymes, and the buffer, the bicarbonate, okay, from the liver and the pancreas. We will mix all of this, and then we basically have this in small little pieces that we're going to move through the remaining portion of the small intestines, and that's now what we call a bolus. Okay, the large intestines, as I mentioned earlier, nutrients should already be absorbed here. You will have remaining water, about 10% of water absorbed, vitamins, and remaining electrolytes. So the large intestines is really important in water and electrolyte balance. The major function of the large intestines is to move the material we now call feces, that is going to be undigestible materials that we need to exit the body. So it's going to move it towards the anus. So the colon is not essential for us to live, although it really, again, does help us stay hydrated, and it basically is a storage place for fecal matter.